This is a project, a joint collaboration by the AFD and the Observer Research Foundation. As such, in fact, this is going to be a very interesting and important project of multi-year project that we are going to take up and develop this particular network. It's going to consist of research outputs as also convenings. Now, one of the most critical elements that I'd like to highlight in here is that whenever we talk about the Indo-Pacific, the first and foremost thing that comes to mind is a security narrative. And at the same time, the bigger challenge lies with development. And when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs as such, which need to be achieved by 2030, the biggest challenge that arises is in the context of global development governance. And from that perspective, we find that the various SDGs, while they're interlinked and entwined with each other, they're often in consonance with each other. At times, they're in conflict with each other. And that is precisely what, in fact, has been hypothesized long ago by Professor Mohan Munasinghe in quite a few of his research. Challenge of sustainomics. How do we reconcile between these contending concerns of equity, efficiency, and sustainability? That in the one framework. Whatever it is, the most crucial element in here is the heterogeneity of the Indo-Pacific, existence of the global North and the global South. At the same time, the flow of finance. How do we ensure the flow of finance to meet the Sustainable Development Goals? We can have all forms of enabling conditions present, but the most fundamental factor, the most fundamental enabling condition happens to be the money out here. So in that context, this project tries to address three crucial elements: climate change, along with it, intertwined with climate change or climate action, happens to be energy transition. So on the one hand, we are talking about mitigation. On the other hand, we are talking about adaptation. And of course, the most crucial element which affected us just a few years ago, and we are still suffering from that hangover, that is, in fact, the global health systems and how resilient, how we can create resilient global health systems. So whereas we have sudden and slow shockers in the form of climate change, there might be, in fact, exogenous shocks that can often impinge on the global system in the form of just as what we encountered in the context of COVID. So with that, that forms the premise of this particular project, this particular network that we intend to develop. And to set the scene today, we have with us the Joint Secretary from the Ministry of External Affairs, Mr. Noor Rahman, who has been dealing with the Division of Economic Diplomacy so far. So I just hand over the baton to Mr. Rahman to set the scene for today's deliberations. Mr. Rahman, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan. And I'm happy to be part of this. I see a lot of experts here who have been doing a lot of work in this field. As already laid out, of course, in the Indo-Pacific region is quite an important region. As we all know, 64% of the world's population inhabit in this region. 60% of global GDP comes from this region. The diversity of this region is immense. And of course, when we think, the first thing that comes into the Pacific is the tensions in the region, the geopolitical tensions in the region. But I think, as we have all seen, how COVID had an impact in terms of the global supply chains, particularly because, as we all know, 2/3 of the world's oil movement goes through this region. 1/2 of the container traffic goes through this region. 1/3 of the cargo moves through this region. There are various. I mean, the region is certainly very important. And that's why we see that a lot of partnership has also arisen in this region. We see, like last May, there's this Indo-Pacific Economic Forum of 14 countries with identified 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, infrastructure, and tax and anti-corruption as 4 pillars identified for it. There are various initiatives which are taken up at the country level, at the mini regional level, or at the Indo-Pacific wide levels. If we talk about the themes identified for the SUPIF network, climate change, energy transition, and global health system, I think these are very important themes which run across each and every country or the whole region in its polarity. Of course, climate change is a critical factor for all of these countries, and there are various initiatives undertaken for it. The challenges that are with it, and when I saw that the energy transition and health systems are there, these are again very important aspects of it. You would have seen initiatives like International Solar Alliance, which is like the launched in 2015, COP21 by Indian Prime Minister and French President in Paris. The alliance has actually become quite a well-organized international organization. It actually started as an organization only for countries within the tropics. It has been universalized since January 2021, and so far 114 countries have signed on to it. ISA is undertaking a lot of projects now in terms of solarization, various solar projects in various countries, including in Indo-Pacific. Another initiative, which is of course linked to disaster resilience, is CDRI, which is again an initiative by India, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, launched in September 2019 by our Prime Minister in New York. This is again got a lot of traction. There are 31 countries and 8 international organizations being members of this alliance. It also is quite relevant, particularly for the Pacific countries and various other countries which face the vagaries of nature. It has a very successful fellowship program undertaking a lot of studies on disaster resilience and things like that. So these are some of the initiatives undertaken by India. We have seen how we have tried to connect with the rest of the countries in the region. If you see looking both westward as well as eastwards, you have IORA, in Indian Ocean Rim Association, being launched, which is more of a west looking thing. Then you have we have this Look East policy of 1992, which was changed to Act East policy in 2015 by the Prime Minister of India, with an acronym we all know, SAGAR. SAGAR is in like Hindi word for ocean and security and growth for all in the region. And with all these perspectives, there are a lot of initiatives undertaken in this whole region. Unfortunately, of course, despite so many of such things happening, which is actually quite relevant to climate change, to economic development, sustainability, financial cooperation, and things like that, still I think a lot of things needs to be done more on this, because the perception that comes out, as I said initially, and of course Dr. Nilanjan also brought it out, it's the focus has been on kind of geopolitical kind of thing, but I think it's more important that grouping like this, the initiative like this, can take a long way in kind of giving that real impact to the people and to the lives of the people in terms of access to energy, in terms of food security, fuel security, and basically like SDG 1, SDG 5, of course, is another aspect where we need to have this gender empowerment. We need to work on all those SDGs. And there are challenges. Obviously we have seen various economies doing so well in this region. We have seen the rise of various countries in terms of their economic strength from pillar to pillar. But then there are countries who still are in the challenging phase. I think the focus for countries doing well in terms of economy need to give that kind of importance and support to the other countries who's required that assistance in the real sense. From the Indian perspective, of course, there is this lot of developmental work that has been carried out in the countries of the region. So for about 27,000 crores worth of development assistance has been provided. It's about $3.5 billion worth of projects have been given in various countries in the Indo-Pacific. So there is a constant, support and assistance provided by the government of India to all these countries. And the various initiatives that are in place, the various groupings, like Quad is another grouping which is again very relevant for this region. We have seen even yesterday the FMs of the Quad countries having those great discussions. So these are interesting times. We have just come out of the pandemic. We have seen how much of importance disruption of a global supply chain, maybe by concentration of say critical minerals in one particular country, can have to the rest of the countries in the region. Or a particular sector being concentrated in a region, in one particular country or a particular few countries could lead to have a lot of impact in various other countries. So I think it's important that we do more cooperation. We exchange notes. We kind of dwell in terms of expanding our cooperation, and then see that the supply chains remain up and running all the times. The food security aspects are taken care of. The fuel security, transition to energy is certainly very important. But then, as we were always just thinking that when we talk of transition to energy is very fine, but then we also need to equally focus on giving access to energy for so many millions of people. I mean, in Africa alone, how many millions do not have access to energy? I think it's a very serious thing that we do. So that's where, concepts like trilateral cooperation has come in. For example, India, France and say UAE making a group of 3 countries to undertake projects in Africa, for example. India and UK doing it in Africa, or India and Australia doing it in Pacific, like that. So there are various trilateral kind of initiatives. Also, there's this recent initiative which was launched last year again, this I2U2, just India, Israel, US and UAE grouping. Again, this focuses on economic projects which actually impact the lives in the ground. So we have like food corridor project identified for it. We have a hybrid renewable battery storage project. It's a very interesting project because we all are focusing on renewable energy a lot in terms of solar or wind or hydro energy. But then this challenge comes in terms of having it 24/7 storage. Of course, a lot of research R&D is going on in various countries of the world to have that battery storage technology available, so that when you have this energy generated, you are able to store it and then use it in on a 24/7 basis. So there's a lot of wastages of energy that take place even now due to the lack of such technology. So there are a lot of discussions, deliberations on seeing that collaboration happens in that level, in that scale, basically. So I think this can set the tone for further deliberations. We would be happy to, of course, get views of the experts. I'm happy that ORF and AFD have come out with this initiative. I think it's a 3-year project that I understand, superb. And our best wishes, and I believe that this will have some real studies and then come out with certain reports and frameworks, so that it can also add to the policy making and implementation of it in the region for the betterment of the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rahman, for setting the scene for the deliberations of the day. With that, I'd just like to turn to Mr. Philip Orlienji, the Executive Director, AFD, for his submissions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presence at this time of the day on Saturday morning. I hope you will be happy with the content and of our discussions. A few words by way of background and to explain why the French Development Agency is working with ORF on this subject and proposing to launch this network. The first reason has to do with the fact that France is an Indo-Pacific country and in a sense working on sustainability, resilience of the region is also something that concerns us directly. And AFD is an Indo-Pacific agency in the sense that 1/3 approximately of our balance sheet is in the Indo-Pacific, including French territories of the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific, and all the countries in which we operate in the region. The second reason is that Indo-Pacific is vital for the success of the Paris Agreement. If the policy changes in the field of energy do not succeed in the region, then the targets of the Paris Agreement will not be reached, that's for sure. And the same cannot be said necessarily for all regions of the world, but clearly Indo-Pacific is strategic also for achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And there's something that shows that very clearly is that the four just energy transition partnerships that are now in place involve 4 countries of the Indo-Pacific in the broader sense of the world, and those are South Africa, Vietnam, Vietnam and Indonesia. And we are involved in all 3 of them as FDS, French Development Cooperation. And the third reason, which was mentioned by Mr. Ghosh in his opening remarks and by the Joint Secretary, is that Indo-Pacific needs, I don't know if I should call it a development leg or a resilience leg, but it definitely needs to work to get the countries of the regions working more closely on a sort of joint resilience agenda, especially in 3 areas which have already been mentioned, but which we can frame sort of a bit differently. One has to do with climate. And the conditions to make this climate transition working, and that includes also things like the one that were put forward by the Joint Secretary on access to energy. The second is financial resilience, and the third is social resilience, and in particular health. On financial resilience, maybe I'd like to add that last year we hosted in Paris the day before the ministerial forum for the Indo-Pacific, what we called SUFIP, Sustainable Finance for the Indo-Pacific. We co-hosted this event with the India Exim Bank, and it was jointly organized with the ORF, and we brought together about 40 financial institutions, public development banks from the region. And the purpose of that meeting was precisely to assess whether there was interest, whether there was traction for this sort of agenda in the Indo-Pacific context. And the response that we got from participants was definitely yes. And this is with this starting point that we continued working with ORF and arrive at the proposal to establish this sustainable development network in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Orlienji. I just request my colleague Dr. Swati Prabhu to make the anchor presentation before we open it to the floor.
Good morning, everyone, and In fact, it's great to see all of you so early in the morning. And we are extremely excited to welcome you all to the launch of the Sustainable Finance in the Indo-Pacific. We call it SUFIP Network for Action. I'll quickly set the context, the development context of the Indo-Pacific. We all know it's an interconnected space between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It comprises of almost 40 countries. It consists of 65% of the world population. It accounts for almost 63% of the world GDP, and around 2/3 of the world trade moves through this region. The region has also emerged as the world's economic and geopolitical hub, and it has become the center of global power and wealth. However, this entire narrative of the region has somehow been dominated by this narrative of securitization so far. And despite the fact that this region faces a number of developmental pressing sustainable challenges. COVID-19 has in fact magnified these challenges, and it has affected much of the global population across geographies in this region, with governments and institutions grappling to deal with the impact, the devastating social and economic consequences of the crisis. COVID-19 has not only, altered the strategic context of the region, but it has also affected the development narrative and the economic trajectory that we have witnessed. And it has also pushed the region back as far as its progress on sustainability or Agenda 2030 is concerned. I'll quickly give some figures in certain important sectoral areas like health, poverty, and nutrition. For example, according to the OECD Health at a Glance Asia Pacific 2020 report, deaths in this region attributed to the pandemic have increased over time, and it has reached over a figure of 1,40,300. In fact, many of the low-income and middle-income economies situated in the Indo-Pacific needed to spend more on health even before the crisis struck. On the other hand, about 85 million people in this region have been pushed into extreme poverty since the beginning of the pandemic. According to UNICEF in 2021, about 396 million people in the region were undernourished, and an estimated 1.05 billion people suffered from severe or moderate food insecurity. This region also houses hundreds of millions of people who lack adequate access to electricity and clean cooking fuels. In fact, it has 7 of the top 10 coal-consuming economies or countries which need to now quickly transition to clean, affordable, and reliable sources of energy. So financing for development clearly is a main bottleneck facing this region. In fact, the pandemic has infused this fresh understanding, and it has brought many sovereign countries to revisit their economic relationship and also increase their existing desire for resilience, autonomy, or self-reliance, particularly with respect to certain strategic sectors like health, food security, energy, etc. One also needs to note that if these national ambitions for securing supply chains and production bases become a shared priority between these geographies aligned with their geopolitical aspirations, development finance here can be that piece of the puzzle. It can bring in greater resilience, collaborating between geographies, integrating their economies, and also widening the support base that we require for joint developmental efforts. Here, international cooperation and partnerships hold the key for supporting these sovereign small island nations, for example, to address their developmental challenges and focus more on factors like resilience, sustainability, and inclusivity. There is also a need here, why we are here and launching this network, to build new partnerships and strengthen the old which existed, to create a space for mutual learning between communities and different stakeholders, and ensure that the knowledge sharing that we do leads to some effective implementation action. So why SUFIP? There are main 3 reasons why SUFIP has been, launched today, is being instituted. As I said, we need to devise innovative out-of-the-box financing mechanism. That's the need of the hour. We are looking for alternative and additional modes of financing and cooperative mechanisms to address these pressing sustainability challenges. And finally, formulating an SDG-focused agenda in the Indo-Pacific within the broader geoeconomic and geopolitical matrix to channelize development finance. So, as mentioned earlier by Philip and others, SUFIP is a joint collaboration between AFD and ORF. It seeks to establish cooperation and knowledge sharing for strengthening these collaborations that we come out with, to build coalitions and development agenda in the region with a particular focus on the Indo-French strategic partnership. That's what is given in the flyer that we distributed as well. Some of the goals, I'll quickly go over them: to locate the sustainable agenda at the heart of the Indo-Pacific, to place development cooperation and partnerships at the center of bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral dialogue in the Indo-Pacific, to build resilient domestic and global communities for strengthening sustainable development, and finally, to create a space for mutual and continuous sharing of knowledge, solutions, and experiences. So there are 3 key thematic areas that we have identified for SUFIP, that is climate change, energy transition, and global health system and resilience. We have instituted a secretariat which is kind of in charge of the dynamics of the community that we create. We've planned 2 Chatham House roundtable discussions in a hybrid mode per year, where we gather the community of experts to discuss about certain issues like development agenda of the Indo-Pacific, brainstorming about expectations from the different subzones of this region, enhancing the Indo-Pacific ties, for example, with the African continent and the Pacific Islands, and also create new bridges between the development agenda and the security agenda. So, with more than 200 experts that we intend to bring together through SUFIP, we want to build new research and knowledge pathways and kind of an idea lab. We want to mainstream development in politics and global, national and federal processes in the Indo-Pacific, reframe discourses through new voices, actors and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and finally share experiences and lead to capacity building through closed-door roundtable discussions between the experts. So before I end, I want to lay down certain driving questions which will, frame our conversation for the next 1 hour. What is the rationale behind enhancing and advancing development finance in the Indo-Pacific? What should be the financial architecture to tackle the sustainability challenge and enable robust partnerships between the development actors in this region? How can India and France bolster the conversation on development partnerships and sustainable development in the Indo-Pacific? What are the financial instruments in vogue? What are their positives and lacunas? What types of innovative instruments and institutions can be thought of to serve this purpose? Can a model of triangular partnership facilitate in opening up alternative modes of financing for this region? And finally, a very important topic, gender. How successfully has gender been prioritized while allocating sustainable finance in the Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. So it is open to the participants. Can we just have the questions?
Yeah, I've kept it in
there.
text.
Please keep them so that participants can have a look at them and intervene. So it's open to the participants. These are the questions the driving questions that we have. We would like you to ponder upon this, and also, in fact, your suggestions, any other forms of interventions that you feel will be relevant in the context of this particular project, on how we drive this project, any other concerns that we should be taking up here. So please feel free to intervene. In fact, I am extremely, I feel overwhelmed with the presence of Sir Nicholas Stern in front of me. So, Sir Stern, in fact, if we can begin with you.
That's very kind of you, and thank you very much for bringing us together in this very important initiative. I thought it might be helpful if I said something about the work that Veera Songwe and Amar Bhattacharya and I did at the request of the 2 presidents of COP26 and COP27, which was directly addressed to climate finance, but finance, of course, which is integrated into the whole development story, because it's 2015. When most of us were there, of course, we had Paris and we had the SDGs, so you have to see those as part of the same story. But the question that we were asked, and the question which we all face, and which is a question which is central to how you've expressed it here, is what kinds of investments are necessary to deliver on Paris in the context of the SDGs. And so we set those out by geography and sector, and looking at the emerging markets and developing economies outside China, that China doesn't need. China, of course, crucial to the whole story, but doesn't need external finance. We suggested that if you take the energy transition, adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and natural capital as sort of the key climate stories nested in this whole development story, the overall investment need would be about $2.4 trillion a year, in 2030. Of course, the whole pathway matters, but just to keep it simple, focus on the flows in 2030. And about 1.4 trillion of that, the biggest part, as we all know when we look at the numbers, is the energy transition. And probably about a little over half could be financed internally. I mean, in most economies in the world, most investment is financed internally. But of course, in some places it's more difficult than others. And then the flow for external finance in 2030 on that basis would be around 1 trillion. This is all deductive, right? Here's the objective, which is the Paris. Here are the investments that are needed. Here's the overall external finance. And so you, looking at it that way, there are 5 elements of finance. There's domestic, internal, private, domestic, internal, public. The public, and everything is going to have to kick in here. You can't do it just by one of these things. So 2 internal, private, public, and 3 external, private, MDBs, or development banks more generally, not just the MDBs, as a good friend Remy keeps reminding us, and correctly so. External, private, external, public, largely through development banks, and the external concessional, which is extremely important because if you look at the investment agenda, as I described very briefly, it's very different. I mean, investing in renewable generation it requires a very different form of finance from natural capital or some parts of adaptation and resilience. So those 5 elements of finance are going to have to be combined in different ways for different kinds of investments. But if you look at the breakdowns, and obviously I can't go through all the analysis now, but if you look at the breakdowns, the flows from the MDBs would have to roughly treble over the next 5 years relative to pre-COVID elements. That's for the direct kind of public projects. You need a lot of external public finance for the grid structures, yeah? Mostly private for the generation. So you have to look through the whole thing. But whichever way you look at it, the flows from the MDBs would have to treble in 5 years, the next 5 years. And that is a very big message. I mean, that is that the whole multilateral development bank system has got to scale up big time if we're to be realistic. Yeah. So this is let me emphasize, it's entirely deductive. What do you need to get to where we've articulated, I think wisely, in 2015, where we have to be. So part of the answer to this story has to be a major scale up of the multilateral development banks and a major scale up in their relationship with the private finance world. Because the private finance world's not going to go there without some sharing and management of risk. It simply doesn't happen. We know that, and it's not flowing, right, in any great scale. So those are the 2 challenges from the MDBs. I mean, there are other things I could draw out, but let me just close on that. It's trebling over the next 5 years. That's a big scale up. It's perfectly possible. Yeah, it doesn't need much in the way of extra capital and in those banks. It's perfectly possible to do that. It needs the will and it needs the decision making. And of course, these countries that we're talking about here are the big part of the story. Now, I gave it sort of for all emerging markets and developing economies, but actually, it's very clear, 2/3 of that is in the region that we're talking about. So I think we have a very, if you follow the logic as it's set out here, setting the context of Paris, as Philippe was and others are describing, a big part of the story is that scale up of the MDBs. There's another part of the story, which is how do you create the conditions for the investment in the first place? It's not just finance, we know that, but I wanted to focus my remarks on the finance side. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Stern. So, especially for bringing out...
Nick will do.
For highlighting those 2 challenges, those 2 critical challenges that the MDBs are going to face, in fact, in the coming years. Now that we have the various MDBs also, I'd just like any of them to intervene on how do they foresee these challenges and what kinds of mechanisms do they essentially intend to employ to combat these types of challenges.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So my name is Claire Alambic. I'm French, but I actually work for the Asian Development Bank. So first on the presentation, the diagnosis that we do at the Asian Development Bank is a bit different. We don't think that there is a lack of financing. Actually, there is a commitment from a lot of MDBs and bilaterals in the region, but also from the private sector, meaning private financial institutions to finance. The issue we are facing is that there are not enough projects. So it's more, everybody's agree on what needs to be done in terms of infrastructure, climate change, blue economy, you name it. But when you look at real projects, we are all fighting for the same projects. So I think this is linked to enabling environment, but also to the fact that as you mentioned, there are some risk sharing that needs to be done. So, the Asian Development Bank works same as the World Bank, same as IFC. We work on the public sector side, on the private sector side. Something that I want to mention here, the ETM, the Energy Transition Mechanism, because as part of your question, you say what kind of financial instruments are in vogue, what kind of innovative structure we can develop. So I'm sure you've all heard about this. So how do we transition countries out of coal? How do we give incentives to sponsor to go out of coal, especially in countries where the coal industry is intricated with social, economic elements? Because you know that a country like Indonesia, for example, they depend a lot on coal for exports. They have a lot of workers working in coal, so it has a lot of implication in their own countries. So we are working on the public sector side with the government to help them transition, have a plan, develop renewables. It has not been easy. As you know, PLN has not granted any new PPAs for the last 4 or 5 years. And then we are working with actually a Japanese sponsor to transition their coal fire plants out. And so that's the kind of thing we are doing. And actually, in terms of climate change, the ADB has committed $100 billion until 2030 to finance climate change. Out of this, 85 billion will go for the public sector, but 15 billion will go for the private sector. I'm part of the private sector operations department. I'm struggling to find projects. So that's a fact. So how do we get sponsors to come into difficult countries, especially, for example, the Pacific Islands that are smaller, that are where bankability is a key issue? So we use donors' money, we use blended finance structure. However, it seems that it's not sufficient. So for me, the real question is about really how do we attract the private sector? Because the public sector is there. We have we are working with all these countries for decades, flooding them with money, grant money, policy-based loans, result-based loans, you name it. But the private sector is not there.
On that note, I have a question maybe for you and also for others. You mentioned that 85% is public sector and 15% is private sector, right? Now, what is the segregation in terms of the projects, in terms of whether it's how much percent is going for mitigation projects and how much for adaptation?
Yeah, that's also another issue. Adaptation projects are very hard to find. So you do flood management, you try to the angle. So now all our projects have to be Paris aligned, and if you look at our portfolio, maybe 90% are for mitigation. Adaptation projects are very hard to find. That's actually the kind of project we can work on in island countries like the Philippines or the Pacific Islands, but otherwise it's hard. So sometimes when you build a new road, you say, we have protected the road against flood, so it's an adaptation project, but it's actually not easy. Yeah.
It is very it's very difficult to distinguish between what relates to the Agenda 2030 and what relates to the Indo-Pacific. And when it comes to the chronology that had been evoked since the beginning of this conversation, this is even more confusing. The question is, could you elaborate a little bit on what you said regarding the lack of actual project, and why is there lack of actual project? Because we end up at the receiving end with demand from all over the world, and then all of a sudden we discover there are not enough projects. I mean, there is probably a reason, but please elaborate on that.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but just no, I just said there are not enough projects compared to the targets. So there are projects, but if you look at the targets that we have set up for ourselves in Paris, but also generally speaking in Asia as the Asian Development Bank, there are just not enough projects. So it's just, so the reasons are very, it depends on the country, but most of the time it's contractual arrangements are not bankable. So the concessions agreement, the way the power purchase agreement are drafted, or if you look at another sector than power, for example, recycling. So everybody's talking about the blue economy now, that's a big theme. But you don't have any enabling environment for the collection of waste, for example. So the feedstock is an issue. So you have a lot of developers willing to have recycling plants, but then the risk is how do you get your feedstock? How do you get the recycling material to then recycle? The offtake is no longer an issue in this case because all the big corporates have commitments to have recycled content, but the feedstock is an issue. And this is because in countries, the collection systems are not ready for that. And this is also linked to, it's much more complex than just setting up a collection system. If you look in India, it's linked to the caste system, for example. It's linked to social dimensions as well, right? So how do we work with government? How do we make things change with policies, but with very complex implications that have effect on more than on the short term, right? It's a long-term work that we have to do. So we are doing that work on the public sector side with governments, with municipal, with SOEs, but it takes a lot of time, and we are running out of time because our objective is to have all these projects 100 billion deployed by 2030. It's very short.
Could I just add something to that? That the investment needs that I was describing for delivering on Paris by geography and by sector, we're simply looking at, if you want to get the energy transition, which is the biggest part of the story, of course there's much more, but if you want to get the energy transition in place at sufficient speed, because the speed is dictated by the physics, if you want to get that done, these are the investments that you have to make. So in grids and renewables and distribution and so on. And then the challenge is twofold: to create the conditions under which those investments can take place, and to bring the finance for the investments. And those two parts are interrelated. And it seems to me the job of everybody involved to try to work to create the conditions in which those investments can take place. It's not enough, and I've worked for 10 years in development banks. I was first chief economist of the EBRD and then chief economist of the World Bank. It's not enough to say, oh, well, these projects are not there. Say to a country, you get your act together, and then here's my phone number. And when you've got your act together and the projects are coming, then we'll come along with the finance. You have to work together on both sides of that story to bring the projects forward. That's what the JET-Ps are intended to do, the country platforms that help create the investment climate in which the projects can take place. And of course, the bulk of them, the majority, will be private sector. And that is in large measure about risk management. Risk in terms of the revenue flows, risk in terms of being able to get the practicalities done and the problems solved, as there always will be when you're building things. And then, of course, combining it with the right kind of risk sharing, equities and guarantees and various flexible instruments, as well as the long-term loans and so on. So I sometimes get a bit impatient with the development banks. Say, our project's just not there, it's all too difficult. Well, it's everybody's task to get together and try to create the circumstances. Of course, primarily it's the country where the investment takes place, but to work together to create the circumstances where projects are less risky and the revenue returns are okay, and you combine the right kind of finance. And we're in, and as it was just indicated, we're in a real hurry. What happens in this next 8, 9, 10 years. And what happens in this region, of course, given its size, is absolutely critical.
Just to echo what Nick has just said, our experience of working with public banks in many countries, especially some in the Indo-Pacific, has always been that these public banks, because they've got the network, the domestic network, often have a very good knowledge of where the projects are. And if you think how things works in Europe, for instance, in France, if you want to know more about investment projects in Brittany, you may wish to go and speak to the Caisse des Dépôts, which is our national development bank, or to other banks in the regions, and they're likely to have an idea of what the projects available are. And this is what came out of the first SUFIP meeting. Public banks sitting around the table, the virtual table that day, really have a role to play in knowing where the projects are. So I've heard also this argument about the lack of project, but it's probably it probably requires a bit of extra work to identify at national level through the right channels, public and private, especially private projects, which might already exist without us knowing.
Yes, please. From Japan.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Sachiko Imoto. I'm Senior Vice President of Japan International Cooperation Agency. And listening to all the discussions, I feel a bit uneasy because we have been working in this region for more than 50 years as a development organization. And it's just recent that we started talking about this geopolitics and security. I mean, we have been always here to support our neighbors and cooperate in this region to be prosperous, So I feel very, very uneasy. These days we are talking only about the geopolitics. And in this region, my agency spent annually we spend about 1 trillion Japanese yen. And not only the loan, but we also provide grant assistance and technical cooperation in various fields. And we also have a lot of, strong partnerships with other development agencies, including multilateral, ADB, World Bank, and IFC, and so on. Also, we work closely with IFD. And it often happens that we talk a lot among donors, but there aren't as many places as donors and our partners or recipients sit together. I mean, we talk bilaterally with our partner government. For example, we talk with Indian government, we talk with Indonesian government, but not with, together with all the partners. And there are a lot of, conflicts of interest. And it's not really clear what are the real prioritization for public money. And in principle, we all talk about climate, we talk about health, we talk about infrastructure. But in most of the time, a lot of government would not borrow for adaptation because it generally doesn't create cash, or they prefer spending in infrastructure rather than health, or they would be happy to spend in health infrastructure but not in trainings or building human capacity like that. So I mean, it's not 100% we should be doing that, but there need to be balance, and there isn't agreement in balance. I mean, how we should be spending our money. And also when we talk bilaterally and only we among the donors, it often happens there is a competition and we start juggling the projects. And that is very unhealthy competition. So we really need to be in, we are not competing one particular project, but we need to have the division of labor among partners, including private sectors. And we should be focusing on our own strength to maximize the resources we have for this region. And for that, it's very important our partner countries and we are on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. and congratulations to both India and France for putting together at least one project for Indo-Pacific. Now, coming from Bangladesh, a relatively smaller country and still not sure which way to go, how do we see this project? Now, there are many ways we could look at this particular project, which is that it is a sustainable development project with the caveat of Indo-Pacific. Now, as a smaller nation, we see that there are other similar initiatives like Global Development Initiative launched by the another big power. And what that concerns us is that we see a increasing tendency to politicize development projects. So I think that we need to keep in concern, and whenever these kinds of initiative comes, some of the smaller nations of Indo-Pacific gets little bit of concern, and that we need to take care of it. Very interesting debate that whether there's enough development financing or enough projects. I'm little kind of taken aback by this debate at this stage, where developing countries have really gone all out to get funding for various development initiatives, in particular in the climate change. In fact, the concern that we have, the issue that we often raise, that there is not enough money coming in for projects in the developing countries which are affected by the climate change. So it's really a very good to hear that there is not enough projects for funding. And we know how the climate change funding has frustrated some of the countries, including Bangladesh. Now, on this, I will just raise some very good presentation by Dr. Swati. Now, when you talk about you're launching a project, who are included in the project from the Indo-Pacific? That's the first question. I know that certainly India and France is included, but who else? Is there a criteria set for that, or is it open? So that's one question. Second question is that undertaking this project would bar any country from taking similar funding or a project from the other initiative that's currently being floated. Thank you very much.
I mean, there are a few interesting things coming out right now. One is that, which was mentioned by my colleagues from ADB and as also JICA. It is in the context of mitigation and adaptation, returns, money, risk. Nick mentioned about it. Now, what are the parameters that a DFI essentially looks at while giving money, as far as the development finance is concerned? Is it that 10% of the funding or 10% of the projects are into adaptation, primarily because the risk-adjusted returns are substantially low out there? Are you really looking at the economic returns? That's why mitigation projects are getting more money, more finance. In that case, I presume that this is going to go against the concerns of some of the smaller nations, including what you mentioned about Bangladesh, and also, in fact, vulnerable regions in parts of the global south. So how do we create instruments to entice development financial institutions, as also, in fact, the target nations, to create projects which can help the process of adaptation as well? Because it is not possible that certain nations might not have the wherewithal to get into these types of mitigation projects, whether you talk of nature-based mitigation or energy transition. So any intervention from any of the DFIs, please.
Thank you. Maybe I will start with the question from our colleague from Bangladesh. So when we created this network with Swati and Nilanjan, we actually took the same geography that we had during the conference, which is to actually have 5 subzones for the Indo-Pacific that goes from the Pacific, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and Eastern Africa. So we really tried in the network to have this balanced representation, because otherwise we can't have actually a very coherent and comprehensive apprehension of the Indo-Pacific, especially with the security dominated narrative. I will not maybe answer exactly your question, but I would like to react about the debate regarding the lack of project or the finance that is already there. I guess that actually when we are exploring projects, when it's with a guarantee of states or without a guarantee of states, we are also always looking at the economic situation of our counterparts. Even if we are talking about a government, a state, a province, a PSU, any type of counterparts. And this is also what we can call intern constraints, or also maybe a responsibility when we are lending, because looking at this economic assessment is also providing sustainable finance for the counterparts. But what I would like to say here is, when we are debating about lack of projects or finance that is already there, I am wondering if we are putting our internal constraints on the shoulders of our counterpart, saying like there is no project because actually we're not able to lend to people who are more risky, because they are not able to have this finance structurally, or because they don't have the, and I don't like this word, capacity to do it. But I guess then we should do more empowerment for the counterpart by bringing more technical assistance, more transfer of technology. So I agree actually with you when you say that the real issue is de-risking. How can we risk, how can we build new tool to have more risk sharing, more guarantees between donors? Because then we will actually reach a solution where we're not talking about our internal constraints and on the market of projects, how can we match it better? So I will leave also the other colleagues answer your question. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone. This is not the usual platform I'm on. I'm more of a foreign policy and a security expert, but I'd like to thank all of you for bringing me in. I found the take on the project extremely interesting, and I thought the idea of bringing security and development, which is increasingly resonating across platforms. But the fact I thought to myself as I was listening to the presentation was, if we reorder the words and talk about not just security and development, but we talk about sustainable security development, I think it really starts making you think differently, because it still puts security at the perimeter, but I'm talking about how do you make what we are creating as a security product, and that reframes the whole argument in a sustainable fashion. Because you can't just keep on mixing the two and saying, well, it's like oil and water, and sometimes it'll mix and sometimes it'll won't. Because that's what I'm getting when I come at it from the other side, right? I mean, you just correctly pointed out that the whole thing is securitized. So if I take that as a given and we have no choice, but if I frame it that whatever initiatives we are taking and that produces security, right? I mean, a sustainable system, sustainable climate change, sustainable funding, then all of that in the end result, enhances our collective quotient of security. And I would just request you to consider that. Two other points I just want to put on the table. One is, it's phenomenal you have a project like this to study, and it'll create a lot of database to take forward research and help other things. Is to also question, a colleague pointed out there's a lack of projects, but what are the political impediments to accessing this? Does it is that political impediment connected to the existing country in terms of its own architecture, or the political system which sees funding as a negative? It allows you to stay. I think that's something also to ask. How politically risk averse? Let's get the political part of it, because there has to be a drive to do that. I think that's an important. And a third point, and quickly close on that, is the capacity to absorb projects. I mean, like there's a lot of money on the table, but what is the capacity? Maybe there is no capacity even to initiate something. So you need to have before the project starts, you'll need to really, create that kind of a scale where this can happen. And probably that's worth considering where already, some projects have taken off. What was the level already there for a capacity, for absorption? And why in certain countries a comparative thing could be seen, where there is a lack And would that then be a first step to intervene? And just quickly, because I think Swati pointed out there are 10 coal countries, this is a political issue, at least in India. There's a whole constituency which may not want that to go off because there are political dividends which accrue from it. And so the notion of moving to an energy transition can also be, internally there may be pockets of resistance to it as long as there's a political dividend, which is also an economic dividend. And I think those things need to be brought on the table to identify that, do we see similarities of political emancipation in decision making to enable and go across on this transition, or there are these resistance, and how do you work then on those kind of issues? So thank you.
Thank you. In fact, I presume that most of the security experts consider development as a non-traditional security issue, right? So that's the jargon that you keep on using. Shutapa.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Shutopa Chaudhary. I am coming here representing the British government. I work for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, leading our regional Indo-Pacific program based here in Delhi. Just firstly to say, I think the rationale for this project aligns very, very strongly with some of the themes that my team works on. So climate change, building economic resilience, and economic connectivity more broadly. So I'm really excited to see how this progresses and also to be a part of it, because I understand that knowledge sharing is a very, very important part. I sparked on something that Alize said earlier, and then I'm going to talk about political constraints. You probably are aware of the ASEAN Green Catalytic Finance Facility, which is a partnership amongst a multitude of donors governed by the ASEAN Infrastructure Programme. The British government, the French, the Koreans, Italy, EIB, there are numerous. But what's really interesting about this modality is that it's a blending of the finance together with technical assistance, which is what you were talking about. So the technical assistance that you need to structure the projects so that you have a matching between the availability of finance and the types of bankable projects, and providing that kind of expertise to design projects so that they're not seen as such high risk. So I think that's a really interesting model where you're at the same time providing concessional finance, making finance more affordable in parts of the world, together with the technical expertise required to actually design them. So that's one thing. Secondly, I just want to come on to this point about the sort of political constraints and vested interests, because I think we've seen this being a real problem and binding constraint to making progress. So we've been funding for the last 10 years or so a series of programs to unlock regional integration within the BBIN to start with. So Indo-Pacific for us is a relatively new construct, I think, for the French as well. And but the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal is a much older kind of grouping that we've been working on as the British government. And specifically, we've been trying to make connectivity between the countries stronger. So essentially to get goods and people to travel between countries in the region more smoothly, more cheaply, because I think you all know that it costs more to move goods between India and Bangladesh than from India and Brazil, something crazy like that. There are some quite powerful metrics out there. And so we've come to the end of a 3-year research project with CUTS, and I was launching this a couple of days ago, their final research paper. And I'm really struck by how much we know already about the regional, the opportunities if the region was better connected. And yet there is so far to go in terms of unlocking those barriers. And a lot of it comes down to the political economy constraints, specifically the vested interests and the winners and the losers, the people that stand to lose if trucks move freely between India and Bangladesh, specifically the northeastern states. And the distance between India and Bangladesh, if you go through the Siliguri corridor, it's tiny, right? And yet trucks are moving all the way around, and I think it's 1,000 kilometers extra is being added on to the journey because of that, the lack of implementation of the multi-vehicle agreement from 8 years ago. And so all of this makes me wonder about the financial architecture and the kind of governance mechanism that's going to make anything that's regional, whether it's BBIN or Indo-Pacific, for it to work properly. Who is governing it? Whose interests are being served collectively and who's losing out? And so for me, the ASEAN, the Green Catalytic Finance Facility sounds really compelling because there is a natural governance structure there. The ASEAN finance ministers look at that, will be looking at those projects. But when we think about the Indo-Pacific, apart from the ASEAN, what are the other kind of groupings and institutional arrangements which can help us progress some of these development partnerships? I don't really have the answer to those questions, but those are the things that I'm thinking about, and I'd be really happy to join forces with SUFIP and kind of delve deeper into them. Thanks.
Thank you. I think you wanted to. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Rafiq Dosani. I work for the RAND Corporation in the United States. I have a question, just like I don't have answers. So my question is, in terms of sequencing of funding different projects, are we on the right paths there? You know, it seems to me normally the host government must make the environment suitable for private investment. They may lack the technical skills to do so, for which they need support. But until that soil is, in a sense, soft enough to accept private investment, it's not going to happen. So I'm wondering, could that be one of the real issues that we should be concerned about? You know, I took your example of trade facilitation, for example. A project I did some years ago had a country. I was looking at Nepal companies trying to sell tea in India. But there's a regular route of that tea traveling from Kathmandu to Delhi. But when they had buyers in Kolkata, it had to go via Delhi to be cleared before it went to Kolkata. You know, that sort of easing of the system, I think, is what we should be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafiq. Dulciana?
Hello, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for the invitation to attend this important meeting. My name is Dulciana. I'm from Papua New Guinea. I work as a development practitioner, and I just wanted to provide some context to this entire discussion and the importance of the intervention points, the engagements. There's some low-hanging fruit in the Pacific Islands. For us in Papua New Guinea, where we are very extractive, resource-rich, natural resource-rich, our diversity is remarkable, our cultural heritage is diverse, and of course provides or is perhaps the explanation or the reason for why we are such a high risk destination. The main issue that I see for us is our institutional incapacity. Data is not well respected in my country. The rule of law and democracy have become major problems as we head towards 50 years of independence. We have had traditional partners in Australia and New Zealand, and certainly the British more recently, and new friends. The United States has a bigger presence in Papua New Guinea. I see that the biggest challenge as we talk about a lack of projects is the cumbersome internal institutional requirements and strategic priorities of the donors. Australia has recently put together an international development policy which may provide a useful framework, being our longest, well, first of all, our coloniser, but secondly, our biggest provider of grant and overseas development assistance. We have major internal reform issues. Decentralisation has been a problem. So finance reaching the coalface is a very, very massive problem. We suffer from political instability. Our democratic system is defined by political parties. For instance, we have a 118-member legislature with obviously an executive government of about 38 ministers. We have probably an equal number of vice ministers. Now, our own internal confusion distracts from the importance of the fact that we now have a black economy in Papua New Guinea. that has been facilitated by our new friends, and so which is compromising our bureaucracy first and foremost. I don't think there's an absence of projects in our countries. I think, I guess the internal cumbersome, for want of a better term, the accountability measures from the donors is a major issue. But I think secondly, as donors and all of our friends, private sector included, are spectators to our internal processes of our electoral process. We just had an election. Free and fair is questionable. And if our donor partners sit as spectators in our jurisdictions and watch very important events not come together in a democratic way, that becomes the starting point of the conversation, because we ourselves have borrowed beyond our means. And excuse my language, but we've been spending like drunken sailors without the austerity, without the appetite for reform, and yet we continue to engage in borrowings beyond our means. We have a 60% debt to GDP ratio. In the absence of data, we're not able to economically model each of the primary sectors that require the economic investments for jobs and growth and tax to occur in our country, so that we may be on an even playing field to be able to accept projects that both work for donors and for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.
Hello. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm Tara Varma. I'm a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. I have a question as well to the authors of the report and to people here. I know it's not a silver lining, but the European Union has put forward a plan called the Global Gateway, which is supposed to tackle a number of issues that have been raised here, particularly the adaptation issue. The Global Gateway is supposed to provide a financial vehicle to come about the green industrial transformation. So it's supposed to be a long-term plan. How are the questions that have been raised here, are they being weaved into this potential? How are you thinking about it? I've been thinking about what Elise was saying about empowerment. If it's about empowerment from the public and private sectors, then there needs to be the idea that people take responsibility for the projects that they want to put forward. Can the EU help with that? Do you think that's a possibility?
Before we respond to Mr. Huck, you had something to say?
Yeah, just that one area that our distinguished colleague from the British High Commission raised. I think she's to some extent correct in terms of ferrying goods and services across the border between Bangladesh and India and India and Bangladesh. But over the last, about a decade, things have drastically also improved in terms of connectivity. Now you can find a ship traveling from Bangladesh to all the way to Kolkata, Haldia port, carrying goods and services. So certainly things have improved, but there's a lot to also improve. But in terms of BBIN, since someone who has been instrumental in conceiving it and then pushing it forward, from Bangladesh side, we were absolutely surprised by the move that Bhutan took in terms of delaying joining the BBIN, because we thought it has a huge potential in terms of both political and economic because of multi-party participation. Since then, we have also moved, leaving out Bhutan for a later stage to come and join. These are some of the initiatives which are making a fundamental change the way some of the regional countries do trade and services. So I just wanted to flag this. The other thing I just thought, when the SDG were conceived, 7-8 years back, the global environment was so different than today, that when we are talking about taking projects today, even in the sustainable development, we possibly have to consider much deeper in terms of creating a trust among the partners who are participating in the projects. Because for some of the smaller countries are extremely concerned that are we sort of risking our long-term relations and stability in the region by participating one and not the other. So that, I think, need to be considered in this project if you're thinking of bringing in a smaller partner. And why can't we move from the security to human security? They make it more neutral. So we can say that, it's not hard security, it's not soft security. We're talking about human security and development. Then it makes, I think, it assures some of the smaller, less powerful countries comfortable. Thank you. Yes, please.
Just to add to the colleague from Bangladesh and of course to respond to the colleague from the UK Foreign Office. As pointed out by the Bangladeshi colleague, there are a lot of work that's ongoing actually in terms of connectivity. If you see with India and its neighboring countries, as he rightly said, in the last, I would say, couple of years, you will have heard of Kaladan multimodal project, Sitwe Calcutta connectivity port we have already launched just recently. Of course, because of the security situation in Myanmar, there's an issue that to link it up for the trilateral highway, project, which is supposed to go from India to Myanmar to Thailand and then connect to the whole of Southeast Asia. There are a lot of, call it ICPs, integrated customs points, which are being set up between, India and Nepal, India and Bangladesh, India and Myanmar, Nepal. So a lot of connectivity work has actually started. It's in progress, I would say. And in terms of a lot of the lines of credit that we provide are actually in this field. And I also like to join a lot of voices when we heard a colleague from MADB saying there's this lack of project. I think that needs to redefine, and I think that the various responses that come in terms of capacity building is required, maybe hand holding, for example, like a colleague from PNG has mentioned about the various difficulties the country is going through. Probably the debt to GDP ratio is about 60%, a huge kind of thing. So I think this when I mentioned the lack of, let's say, access to energy, like 600 million people do not have access to energy so like that's a huge number. So I think we need to find ZP is a very important thing. Even India is also like the discussions which have started on ZP thing. People asking where is this climate finance committed, where is has it come? So there's a lot of frustration. I mean, that the finance is just not coming. Of course, I mean, you have the timelines, the 2.4 trillion by 2030, and then every year is supposed to get 100 billion. And things like that, but how much of it is actually on the ground? So I think it's just not that the commitment is there, but I think to realize it on the ground, I think that hand holding is also required with the partners. So I think the observation by the Japanese colleague that that talking with the recipients and donors and among the project implementing agencies and recipients is very important. I think I think if people if donors are so keen and just because of the conflicting interests is not able to do it, I think it's a pity, I would say. So it's I think there's a lot of work that this study could do in terms of actualization of this kind of financing. As Professor Salma mentioned, sustainable security development. Again, it's very novel concept. Obviously, so it's all about human. Security is human security. So it's all about human lives. So it's about all these SDG goals. We all know 17 SDG goals is quite comprehensive in a way. So I think it's a way of taking it forward. So I just put in there. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. We are in the last 10 minutes of this session. So any other responses? In fact, would like to respond to Tara's question.
Yes. Thank you very much for your inputs. I think to answer the question about whether joining the network will imply not joining other networks, the response is clearly that there are no such conditionality to join the network. And again, those who took part in the first SUFIP were invited with no strings attached, and no one among those who were invited refused to come, and those who were not invited even asked to be invited. But I think it is also important, and this to some extent answers the question about politicization. It's important to have around the table practitioners, because the type of engagement that you can have among practitioners, I'm a career diplomat, so I can say that is not exactly the same as the one you will have if there are only diplomats in the room. And I think this is also something that we aiming at in the design of the network. On regional partners, the point raised by a colleague from the FCDO, this is certainly something that we must add to the questions and the thing to be looked at, because they are probably more than the one you mentioned. I think in the area of health, there are a number of regional institutions that we could work with more closely, but there aren't many and probably not enough in certain areas. Thinking, for instance, of what we try to do in areas such as diversity, mangrove protection, the lack or insufficient regional actors is probably hindering deeper cooperation. This probably we have to add to the list. On Global Gateway, maybe one of the things that the network could look at is how to operationalize the Global Gateway policy inspiration, because it has yet to translate into different way of doing things. But thanks for raising that. I think it's certainly worth having it and also involving the EU or the Commission in the work of the network.
Oh, sure. Fine, thank you very much. Anybody else on my extreme right? Any intervention from your side?
Hello, everybody. I am Kim Hong-jong from Korea, South Korea. I am from the Criminal Research Institution, KIEP, and my institution has quite a big research team, center for the ODA, and so I'd like to ask some questions and also comments on the several issues. The first of all, as for the still, I mean, you have already answered, but still, I'm curious about the relations between EU and then France on development strategy on this Indo-Pacific areas, because I don't think there is the kind of the hindrance, but of course I'm supporting relations, I think. But the development strategies, of course, is not the explicit competence of the European Union. So French government and the French public sectors have a much wider room for the initiate this kind of the research project, or also the practitioner as well. But anyway, I'm curious about these relations. And the second one is about the energy transition. And in Indo-Pacific areas, there are so many diverse countries here. And then some countries like India, Korea, and then Vietnam, and many countries with a huge amount of the manufacturing sectors. We are more focusing on the transition finance rather than the the traditional areas of the sustainable finance. But in the Indo-Pacific area, there are so many island countries, as you said. So I think that the traditional areas of sustainable finance is utmost important. Even we agreed that last year that transition finance is one of the utmost impotence for the future direction of the sustainable finance. And then the third one is the security issues. I think that this issue is directly linked to the economic security. So security and then this development cannot be separable. And so I think that we need to think about more focus on the how to secure the economic security in these areas. And then I think that this concept could be applied to facilitate the finance for the sustainable finance. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shambhavi. I head the Advanced Biology program at Takshashila Institution, which is an independent think tank based in Bangalore. So I really don't come from the financing side. I'm quite new to this conversation. But I look at two things. I look at health systems and I look at biotech cooperation in India. And throughout this conversation, I was thinking about, well, development, and I understand green financing to a limited extent. Unless we are putting money into getting more revenues from an Indian perspective, I don't really understand just building growths, etc., leading to sustainable finance, because there are not going to be a lot of revenues. There's not going to be a lot of, there'll be temporary job development. I'm very sorry if I'm completely on the wrong page here. But for me, for example, from a biotechnology point of view, biomanufacturing in India is going to be extremely important. If we use traditional methods of developing biomanufacturing, there are going to be climate consequences eventually. But to use green financing for greener methods or cleaner methods for developing biomanufacturing, we are not going to have the economic competitiveness with the end products that we create. So how do we actually then develop our economic growth or sustain our economic growth without creating opportunities for more green financing in that sort of areas? This is something that I've been struggling over for the past 1 hour trying to understand. While I understand a lot of the green financing conversations and trade, etc., from an Indian biotech perspective, I think what we need is more understanding of what economic development is going to require. I'm sorry, I'm completely sorry if this is completely a wrong line of thinking.
It's okay, these are relevant issues. Every issue is relevant. So, Bruno has been silent throughout the session. So, maybe something from you before we get into the last bit of it.
Thank you. No, thank you. I don't want to make any concluding remarks. It was a very interesting conversation. My main, let's say, takeaways that I have along this conversation is really what is to me, in fact, lacking is at some point, yes, creating this platform where we bring, in fact, the different stakeholders. There is no lack of initiatives, there is no lack of tools, there is no lack of potential project or funding. But yes, how we bring practitioners, as mentioned by Philippe, around the table, and then in fact we create this connection. That's, I guess, what is useful, and at some point is also what this SUFIP network is eager to create. So it's not bringing more funding, it's not bringing more ideas, but at least it aims to align the different institutions, and specifically, as you mentioned, Alizé, how at some point we find a way to align our respective agendas, because we are all driven by our respective agendas, our targets, our main political drivers, and if we want to go relatively in the same directions with the same target, at some point we need to find ways, and in fact to align these agendas, and that's just putting on this table this agenda to see where has a convergence among themselves. So that's really what I look forward through this network. Thank you.
I don't think there is any other intervention. Anything from anybody else? Otherwise, so we are, in fact, we have to end this session right now because we are past time. But because we started a bit late, so in fact I could stretch the session by around 8-10 minutes. So in fact, host of issues came up, host of concerns and questions, which definitely will be feeding to this particular project in the years to come. Sustainable development financing has to go into those geographies, those sectors where there is development deficit, undoubtedly. That's the first and foremost thing. But at the same time, what happens when you also have governance deficit out there? When the geography which is going to receive that money simply doesn't have that wherewithal to use that money. That is first and foremost, that's the question that comes. So that is why, in fact, we find lack of projects, quote unquote. Now, here the bigger concern is that there is a clear mismatch between what DFIs define as projects and what recipients define as projects. So convergence that Bruno had been talking of, probably we have to bring in a convergence out there in the definition. Now, who is going to take up the onus? Is it going to be AFD, FCDO, and World Bank, ADB, and all the DFIs reaching out to the concerned recipients? Or is it going to be the recipient nation or the recipient geography approaching the DFI and learn more about it? I think this is to be something like both have to come together. So I presume that, in fact, in some of the next meetings, apart from having the DFIs, we also need to have the civil society and the communities in place. So technical assistance is something that you mentioned is very, very crucial out here. We need to have practitioners on board. There is no doubt about that. It is not sufficient that we only have the diplomats and the bureaucrats being here. We need, in fact, the entire civil society. It has to be an integrated approach altogether, getting, in fact, all the stakeholders. So technical expertise, and only then, in fact, we have the technical expertise, we take this integrated approach, we have the plethora of experts, we have the bureaucrats, we have the diplomats, we have the DFIs, we have the community, and that will lead to a more viable, robust, and a sustainable platform. And probably that can be the initiation of a better institutional mechanism, as also maybe may lead to conceptualization of more viable instruments in this format. So let me at the very end thank all of you for this breakfast session, because I can pretty well understand that this is the weekend, and even then you could turn up at 7:30 in the morning, and I had a host of takeaways from this particular session. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to all my AFD colleagues, Philip, and of course Mr. Rahman for taking his time out and setting the scene.